Hello, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I'm here with Philip Michael Hero, and we're going to be talking a little bit about distributism. And if you aren't familiar with him and haven't seen his channel, if you like my stuff, you'll definitely like his. So go ahead and introduce yourself next.
Great. Yes. Hello, Vincent. Good to see you. And hello to my channel as well, because this is going to be probably posting on both of our channels. So if you haven't seen Vince's, do you go by Vince or Vincent? I didn't ask that question earlier.
I usually prefer Vincent in most
Okay,
contexts. Used to
that's
be
great. Well, I
Vince,
prefer
but
I prefer Philip, so that's great. I'll remember that way. So yeah, if you haven't seen Vincent's channel, go check it out. He does some cool stuff with video games and pop culture, which I like pop culture when it's associated with like philosophical context, and he does that. So it's a great channel. So yeah.
all right. So as mentioned today, I wanted to talk about distributism and where I think we both, not to necessarily speak for you, but where I think we both think that it goes wrong as a sort of third way, distinctively Catholic political theory. And so we've got some general topics for discussion for this. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that distributism is a very interesting concept, and they always want to present themselves as a third way, which is understandable. The Republican and Democratic dichotomy is a very small spectrum, and it's understandable why someone would want to be outside of that spectrum. And I think it's true to some extent that distributism is a third way, but it's not the only third way. The reality of it is the political spectrum is much larger than that. And I think that it's important to realize with distributists that it is not necessarily the church's teaching. It is the interpretation of the church's teaching by several individuals in the early 20th century, which is relatively late in church history. And they are applying what they understand of church teaching to the government and trying to create a political system out of that. And it's understandable they want to do that, and I think that's a fair thing to try to do, but it in my mind is quite discontinuous, discontinuous, if that's the right way to say it, with the
Something
previous
like that.
2000 years of church history. I think that there are other third ways that go back earlier, uh, most notably libertarianism, which is why I am a
Mhm.
libertarian. So I don't know if you have more to say about that, but yeah.
Yeah, likewise. I'm this is a kind of meeting of the minds here too, because it's unfortunately not every day that you find, seriously intellectual Catholic libertarians who can talk about these sorts of things. So I'm glad to. But yeah, and I think I mean I will say it goes back a little bit further than the 20th century because if you go to like Hilaire Belloc, when he first started writing on the subject, it was late 19th century.
Yeah,
Um,
fair
so
enough.
it's in there though, right? It in church history, late 19th century, early 20th century, it doesn't matter. That's still like yesterday. And to be maybe a little uncharitable, it's I think noteworthy that that all of these distributist writings and this entire distributist tradition is all post Marx. Every aspect of distributism and every distributist writer is owes a lot to Marx, especially in his
Yes.
economic aspects, if not his political aspects. Certainly not the same disastrous political aspects necessarily, but in his economics, they certainly do follow Marx to the detriment. But we'll get to
Well,
economics in a while. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's important because I try to economics is great. I do try to focus more on the morality. I had been
Hmm.
uh what convinced me of libertarianism was actually not the economics, was the morality. Reading Lysander Spooner's No Treason and before that Friedrich Bastiat's The Law were really the deciding factors for me. And I think that when a distributist will point out to us, hey, you can't put your economics before morality. That's a silly statement because economics is they're conflating things there, but
Right.
but
They're separate
they're
questions,
they're
right? They're,
grasping at something though that's legitimate. If
mhm.
if science says the best way to feed people is by killing all of the redheads, to use a Rothbardian analogy, not because you're a redhead, but that's an analogy Rothbard likes to go to. My mind goes to
Mhm.
that right away. But
It's only the beard that's red. I'm safe, I think.
okay, great. Uh, Well, I guess it depends on who's how strict the ruling authorities are going to be about that.
Right.
But the yeah, if that's the way to make sure there's no world hunger, if we just have to, anytime there's a redhead, we immediately do the way of the Spartans with them.
Hmm.
Well, that's still immoral, so we can't do that. So I think when a distributive says that, they are grasping at something good and true. They're just misunderstanding what economics is. Economics isn't making moral judgments. It's saying what the best way to do X, Y, or Z is. If you want to prosper, yes, this is the way to do it, but it's not saying you should do that. It's more of describing, which is why you have people who are Austrian economists that were not libertarians ultimately. Now, you might have more to say about that than I do. I'm not really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an economist either. Just full
Yeah,
disclosure. If anyone who knows me and knows my channel know that I'm in economics. I'm a dabbler at most.
yeah, same.
Um, but the other aspect, the moral aspect, I do have relevant expertise there. But I also think we we have a tendency, we meaning anyone who thinks carefully about things, whether that's at an official, credentialed scholarly level, or just people who want to know things, whether that's on the internet or at a university or whatever. We have a tendency to over compartmentalize with different disciplines, right? And I know this as a philosopher, and a lot of the philosophers that I know and interact with, a lot of my colleagues, are extremely dismissive of certain other fields, and economics is near the top of that list. In the same way that maybe stereotypically, and maybe it's a negative stereotype, but in the same way that I think a lot of physicists tend to be dismissive towards philosophy, we have that same tendency towards economics. In fact, there was a good article about this. It was a long time ago by Jeffrey Tucker, who is a big influence on me and especially the sort of the moral path towards libertarian anarchism. And he wrote an article about why it is that religious people, in particular, seem to struggle with economics and are more often than not are willing to just sort of dismiss it as
Mhm.
mere ideology or something like that. And his thesis essentially is that religion deals primarily with non-scarce goods. Goods like salvation, goods like beauty, the transcendentals, all of these things that don't require economizing. And so when you get to goods that do require economizing, there's an instinct to want to treat them in the same way that you treat the more important things. Right? And that instinct can get dangerous when you start, as you pointed out, that economics is about how to accomplish things given the scarce nature of things in finite reality.
Right,
Yeah, and so if you're dismissing that whole field as mere ideology, or which is a common enough response, then you're going to wind up with an inability to do the things that ethics tells you that you ought to do, or the
right.
obligations that God tells us that we ought to have. And we just can't accomplish them if we don't know how to.
Yeah, and I think that Thomas Sowell in his Basic Economics gives a good analogy that I think is helpful for understanding economics outside of just like money and politics. And he talks about a
Hmm.
doctor, a military doctor who's in the trenches, and six people have been shot, and he can only help one of them. One of them is definitely a goner, but he's still there. He could comfort him as he's dying. The other person he could definitely save. The other person he might be able to save, but he's going to lose a leg. Who do you help? Well, that's an
Hmm.
economic question. It's not a moral question. It's an economic question. Now, morals has something to say there to some degree. Like, is it moral
Hmm.
to give the effort to someone who you can't actually save versus someone you could? There's some morality there, but like how to use the resources in a way that's most efficient is an economic question. Morality is not absent of things to say in that question, but they're two separate questions.
Yeah, they inform each other, but it is important to keep the domain separate. Right.
Right. Yes,
Hmm.
indeed. Yes, indeed.
Hmm.
So saying that you shouldn't let economics override your morality is like, well, that's not how that works. It's like you
Right.
shouldn't let your science override your morality. It's like, well, the science isn't a moral question. If the best way to split the atom is X way that doesn't answer whether you should split the atom. It's a totally separate moral question.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's hopefully that's makes sense. This is definitely outside of my main economics is definitely outside of my main realm because I read a lot of it and then I immediately started getting more into morality as I focus more on the as I progress more in life.
It is, I will say, I have a great admiration for people who study economics that they can manage to drag themselves through that subject area. It cannot keep my attention for very long, unfortunately. Um, I've got a solid grasp on the basic principles,
Yeah, same.
um, but but beyond that, beyond economics in one lesson and some associated texts, I it's only relevant to my interests and research where it intersects with human action, with ethics, with politics, etc., or political
Yeah.
theory, I should say, that kind of thing.
That being said, I think everyone who wants to speak to this kind of topic, and distributors would learn a lot from it. Would be reading basic economics or economics. I actually haven't read economics in one lesson. I have it, but I haven't read it
Hmm. Oh, I
yet.
have
But
50 copies somewhere, I think.
oh, great.
I
Yeah,
the it was from Mises.org. The Mises Institute was sending out a bunch of free copies, and I don't have 50 anymore. I got
okay.
50, and I gave them out to a whole bunch of
Yeah.
people
No, that's great. That's
around the
great.
university. So
Spreading the good news.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I like what
Um,
Rothbard says, though. Yeah, I have a quote pulled up here.
mhm.
It is no crime to be ignorant of economics, which is, after all, a specialized discipline and one that most people consider to be a dismal science, but is totally irresponsible to have a loud and vociferous opinion on economic subjects while remaining in this state of ignorance. And I think it's something a lot of Americans could learn
Yeah.
because it seems like that's something everyone wants to talk on economics in America because we live in a democratic republic.
Hmm.
We all have something to say about it, and or at least we're all asked for something to say about it, and unfortunately, the vast majority don't even have the basics down. And reading a book or two like Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell or Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, or even
Hmm.
just reading some old Friedrich Bastiat, which
Yeah.
has
The law is another major influence on what pushed me towards libertarianism as well. And I'll say, and this actually has to do with the sort of the history that leads us to something like distributism, which I think is, I mean, kind of getting back to the point we were trying to focus on, right?
yes,
Um,
indeed.
and one of the biggest insights that Bastiat draws our attention to in the law is the distinction between the state and society,
Hmm.
right? That these are two different things. That society can have certain organizational principles, even certain rules, or certain ends, or certain goals, or certain structures. But the state doesn't necessarily have to be involved with those for them to be social arrangements, right? Um, I don't have the quote pulled up. I should have the law in front of me. But the probably the most famous quote of the book is where Bastiat points out that just because we object to the state um, running education and running shoe stores does not mean we object to education and shoes. Right? And he lists a whole
Right.
bunch of other things.
Yes,
Right?
indeed. Yeah, that's a
Hmm.
good quote.
Yeah. And I think that this is, like, again, historically speaking, this is a relatively new distinction that really was only made carefully during the Enlightenment, which, to be fair, is after my historical period of actual scholarship.
Mm.
And so in a lot of my more professional reading of the ancients, of the medievals, they don't make that distinction very clearly. Um, in part because they saw politics as a different kind of thing than we see it in the modern period. Because I mean, the nation state hadn't developed yet. That is a relative novelty. The modern nation state really only kind of gradually develops into its fully developed current form in the 20th century.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
under the what is it the German Westphalian Treaty?
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I would even push it a little bit further, more recent than that. The Treaty of Westphalia was, oh, I'm gonna make something up.
I
I
think it was
always
the
joke
19th
that,
century, or
yeah, it
was it
was 19th
17th
century
century? Yeah.
sometime. It was sometime in the 19th century. Um, I always joke that my knowledge of chronological history has a giant gap between 1277 and 1977. Because 1277 was a series of condemnations by the Bishop of Paris of some neo-Aristotelian notions that were going too far with Aristotle, and then 1977, the first Star Wars movie came out, and then history begins again, as far as I'm concerned. In the middle, a bunch of things happened, some of which were important. Like my parents were born. I think there was a whole like new world that was discovered or something. I don't know, something like that. Um,
Australia.
right, yeah, that's it. That's the one. I forget what it was called. The upside down one.
Mhm.
In any case, right. So as I was saying, I think the 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 idea we have of politics, if I'm to put a point on it in maybe a Rothbardian point, and see if you have anything to add to this, is the idea that politics is the study of the use of force or the appropriate use of force for in the organization of society. Something like that sound about right?
Yeah, it's the appropriate use of force for the say it again. I
Yeah,
apologize.
the appropriate role for the use of force for the organization of society.
Yeah, yeah, I could get behind that as the definition of politics.
Mhm.
Even George Washington said, and for those that might question, is politics force?
Mhm.
Even George Washington, if we can call him kind of far right, or I think it's backwards, I'll say far right over here.
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah.
Then Mao Zedong far left over here. Both of them said the same thing essentially. Washington said, government is not is not your friend. It's fire. It's a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Yeah, it is force. He says. He
Mhm.
literally said it's force. George Washington did. And then Mao Zedong said all politics is the barrel of a gun. So like, politics is inherently forceful. You
Mhm.
cannot pass a law and enforce a law. You cannot enforce a law without force, and there's no reason in passing a law if there's not going to be enforced. So it is under the threat of violence. Even the word enforce has the word force in it.
I might push back on that slightly.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just maybe I'm just more pushing back on the assumption of how we think of politics and trying to sort of give the pre-modern notion its due. But I think that there can be a use of passing a law if it's not enforced.
Okay. Well, we'll say
Um,
that.
so it can still okay. So if we think of right, so we have the modern notion of politics as
Hmm.
the question of what is the role for force in organizing society, right? Clearly, the answer is not everything. But there there are other means of organizing society, right? The voluntary ways of organization. But you can also say that you could have laws, so to speak, in some way or another, which are meant to organize and regulate society that are not enforced. They're not strictly enforced, but they could still have the role of, say, setting social norms or codifying existing social norms, right? Whether or not they're enforceable or enforced laws, right? So, an example of this might be, if I have people over my house, say, if I invite some people over for a party, and I say, hey, some basic house rules, take your shoes off before you come in, and somebody doesn't do that, I may or may not ask them to leave. Right? That
Right.
that would be the enforcement mechanism, like in terms of scaling it down to the homeowner scale, right? I might say, oh, hey, do you mind taking your shoes off? Right? I might ask nicely, and they say, hey, no,
Foot
I've got
fungus.
yeah, I've got a fungus. Sure, yeah, I don't want to. I'd be like, oh, all right, that's fine. Just make sure you don't track mud in. He's like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Right, we can kind of negotiate it, right? That is not something that you can do with enforced law. There's no
Right.
like clever little negotiation that's going to go on between you and the cop or the court or the Senate, right? The law is the law, right? But I think that you can have, if you have unenforced laws, you can set them as norms, and then you can work within the fuzzy boundaries of those, because a lack of force allows those boundaries to be fuzzy, but still to have them, right? Now,
Yeah.
all that said, all that said, there's no such thing. in the current nation state, right? That there is no
Well,
such
I
unenforced
can
law.
think of
You're right.
one example off the top of my head, and that is some places have taken upon themselves to remove speed limits and replace them
Hmm.
with reasonable speeds. And
Ooh.
so long as you're driving reasonably, you are not in danger of receiving a speeding ticket. However,
Ooh.
in from what I've read, and I haven't read in this too much, but from what I've read, it's been a dismal failure, and
Interesting.
that basically it's a license for cops to say someone's driving irresponsibly when they need to give
Hmm.
tickets.
Yeah.
So there's no way to say, because you can go too slow too. I mean, at least in Pennsylvania, the law does not allow you to go a certain amount below the speed limit before you become a hazard, and you have to
Right.
put your four ways on. So you can get a speeding ticket that is the reverse direction of what most people get the speeding ticket. And if there, I presumably that exists elsewhere as well. So
Yeah.
if the
Certain
reasonable
highways in
speed,
Florida have like posted minimum speed limits too. That's a thing
okay,
here too.
yeah,
Hmm.
we don't post it. You just have to. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, it's just reasonable.
Okay.
Generally speaking, people say 10 miles under the speed limit. You should have your four ways on, but there's no law.
Huh.
Um, but the the problem when you have a reasonable speed maximum, reasonable speed minimum, but nothing's actually mentioned is what is reasonable could be drastically different from one person to the next person, from one
Hmm.
vehicle to the next. And so, what often ends up happening is the police officers tend to use it to their advantage to give extra revenue to their local township or whatever. Uh,
Right. And there you just have an incentive problem, right? To get into the sort of libertarian politics of the matter.
yeah.
If you incentivize the police to give tickets by, rewarding their department with money, the
Hmm.
money that they take, then yeah, of course they're gonna find reasons to, and you're gonna disincentivize the whole point of the law, right?
Right.
What the stated purpose of the law, which is allowing officer discretion. If you're going too fast, but you're going faster than the speed limit, but you're not doing so dangerously, then the idea is that you don't need to pull somebody over for going 5 miles an hour over the posted limit if they're driving safely. But that's not how it's going to be interpreted just because, incentives matter. Right? So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a really good point. That's interesting. I never actually I never knew about that system. I do know a little parallel anecdote about Florida speed limits.
Yeah. Do tell.
So Florida state roads. So this only applies to state roads. I don't know if this is local, and I think it applies to most interstates, but not as like officially or not as formally. But Florida state highways and state roads, as a policy, the speed limits, the upper speed limits, are set approximately 10 miles an hour under the engineered safe speed
Hmm.
for the given highway or given road.
So it's
There's a
designed to
co-
allow people to speed safely.
that's the charitable explanation. The the
It's designed to
more
make people want to speed.
yeah, well, here's the thing. A lot of roads around here, if you go the speed limit, it feels unsafe because it probably is.
Okay.
Right, for example, there's one highway not too far from here. It's around Tampa area. It's kind of a highway, but it's called a highway, but it's like one of those like 6 lanes each way with stoplights kind of thing. There's a curve, there's a bend in the road where if you are going the speed limit or lower, you have to counter turn. Like the road curves left, but the bank of the road is such that you have to turn your wheel to the right
Hmm.
to actually stay going properly, like
Wow.
in the lane.
So
Because
you
it's
have to slow
very
down.
clearly designed. Well, no, 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 no. The
Oh,
road is very clearly designed for going above the speed limit
I see.
because
Okay.
the bank of the road is sufficient for going probably 65 to 70, where it's a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit.
Interesting.
And now, if you're cynical, which I kind of tend to be with these sorts of things, then, well, there's two different categories of speeding ticket in Florida. There is the misdemeanor, the just sort of citation one, and then there is the reckless driving ticket, which is a lot more money and more points on your license, and it's a bigger deal, and it's
Hmm.
also more rewards for the department who issues them.
Right.
Yeah, and also that money goes to the Florida Department of Transportation primarily, and they're the ones who engineer the roads and decide the speed limits. you can see how the incentive structures start lining up here too,
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well,
Anyway,
this, this,
tangent.
this, this, as an aside, it's just more anecdotal evidence of why we should privatize the roads.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Uh, um,
We all know that
but
we libertarians, we despise roads and everything to do with them.
oh, absolutely, they are the bane of society. If we could get rid of the roads, everything would be fixed. Um, my roads.
Mhm.
By the way, just as an aside, I just sent you
I'd
a
quote
quote
Eric
from.
July on roads, but this is a family-friendly stream, so.
Oh, I don't know his quote on roads.
Oh,
I'm
you
very
don't? Oh, okay. I'll
very
send it to you later
minimally
because it's
familiar with Eric
inappropriate.
July. Okay, okay, yeah, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I
Um,
did send you a quote from St. John Chrysostom. I found a quote that's very
oh, you
similar to
did?
what we were
Okay.
looking for before stream,
Okay.
and
Yeah,
I
that'll bring
did
us back to the sort
confirm
of magisterial
it's
history.
real. Yeah, I did confirm it's real. I didn't read the whole thing. I was trying to kind of read it while
Hmm.
listening to you, and I couldn't do it, so I just gave up. But so I don't want to divide my attention too much. I don't have the ability to split my attention like I used to when I was a young whippersnapper. But
Gotcha. Hey, go for it.
um,
Let's hear it.
so here it's looks like chapter 3 of book 2 of the Priesthood. So let's just if you don't mind, I can just quote this real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
But in the case of human infirmities, it is not easy in the first place for a man to discern them. For no man knows the things of a man save the spirit of a man which is in him. He's quoting 1 Corinthians 2:11. How then can anyone apply the remedy for the disease of which he does not know the character, of which he does not know the character? Often, indeed, being unable to understand it, even should he happen to sicken him with it himself. Let's see here. Sorry, I got too much highlighted here. And even when it becomes manifest, it causes him yet more trouble, for it is not possible to doctor all men with the same authority with which the shepherd treats his sheep. For in this case, it is also necessary to bind and restrain from food and to use cautery or the knife, but the reception of the treatment depends on the will of the patient, not of him who applies the remedy. For this was also perceived by the wonderful man, St. Paul, when he said to the Corinthians, not for that we have condemned, we have, not for that, sorry, this is old English here, not for that we have dominion over your faith, but are helpers of your joy. 2 Corinthians 1:24. For Christians above all men are not permitted to forcibly correct the failings of those who sin. Secular judges, indeed, when they have captured the malefactors under the law, show their authority to be great and prevent them, even against their will, from following their own devices. But in our case, the wrongdoer must be made better, not by force, but by persuasion, for neither has the authority of this kind for the restraint of sinners been given us by law, nor, if it had been given, should we have any field for the exercise of our power, inasmuch as God rewards those who abstain from evil by their own choice, not of necessity. Consequently, much skill is required that our patients may be induced to submit willingly to the treatment prescribed by the physicians. And not only this, but they may be grateful also for the cure. For if anyone, when he is bound, becomes restive, which is in his power to be, he makes the mischief worse. And if he should pay no heed to the words which cut like steel, he inflicts another wound by means of this contempt, and the intention to heal only becomes the occasion of a worse disorder. For it is not possible for anyone to cure a man by compulsion against his will. So, just to summarize that long paragraph, it kind of sounds like the quote we were already looking at that was a fake quote, but this one is
Mhm.
actually real. So it sounds like someone was paraphrasing that and saying it was a real quote. But basically,
Sounds
he's
like it,
saying
yeah.
he is making a distinction between religious moral commands and the general legal legislative body of what judges are there for,
Hmm.
and so it kind of seems like a precursor to that early medieval distinction you were talking about, or I guess the later than early later distinction, where basically you have the religious commands of moral commands and the general societal moral commands. That's how I'm
Hmm.
reading that, at least. That kind of sounds like an early precursor to that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, right. So there's this distinction, right, that he makes between it's essentially the distinction between justice and charity, right, or justice and love. Um, which was kind of fundamental to the sort of medieval Christian political framework, at least political theory. Um, because right after John Chrysostom, somewhere like it was 100 or 200 years later, it's fifth century, I think, was formulated by Pope Gelasius the First, was the two swords doctrine, which carried throughout the Middle Ages and was broadly accepted. And this essentially, I've written on this, which is why I know the dates for these things. Um, it essentially delineates two separate but interdependent spheres of authority, being the temporal and the sacred. Right.
Mhm.
So the authority of the church is absolute over matters of faith and morals, as we would say today,
Right.
right? To use modern language. But that also means that in declaring moral matters and declaring matters of charity, especially, um, and then also of canon law and things like this are declared by the church. But then you also have the other center of authority, which is the crown, the king, or the throne, or what have you. This often gets, I guess, maligned in a modern context as a as the it's often called the throne and altar model, which is the sort of Protestant critique, as best I understand it, of because it's outside my historical area, the Protestant critique version of this, which is the idea that the throne and the altar are always working in sync to screw the little guy. But I think that again, that's a misunderstanding of what this doctrine is really saying, which is that these two sources of authority are both crucially important, but should not interfere with one another. They're mutually reliant, but for the state to try to, or what we would call the state, right? That is, powers and principalities, powers of this world, temporal authorities, whatever. For the state, essentially, to dictate religious obligation throughout the Middle Ages was anathema, like literally anathema. That was inappropriate. That was the king overstepping his bounds, or whatever the
Right.
word might be. Right? Um, and I think that we can sort of hang on to that as a minimum standard, a minimum libertarian standard of, hey, the state, even if it does have legitimate authority somewhere, and maybe we can dispute that, but that's maybe for later. Um,
Yeah.
it certainly doesn't have legitimate authority over the theological virtues, over the sacraments, over the life of the
Right.
church, right? Any of that.
I was actually just discussing that with someone recently
Mm,
because unfortunately, a huge number of people do think that the church has, the state has some authority over at least one sacrament, and
mhm.
that is the sacrament of marriage, where
Yep.
you know. I always say it's like it is absolutely wild to me that we would never tolerate and perhaps I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but it just reminded me of this. You would never tolerate having to get a license to get baptized, having to get a license to get
Okay, hold on
to
now.
administer communion, but
Hold on
somehow
now, because
marriage is
I used to say that. I
yeah,
still agree with it, that we should never tolerate anything like a baptism license. However,
right,
I've since learned that there are some states, and certainly some other nations, but even some states in the US where where you do need, I don't know, it's not a license in the same way that it's a marriage license, but
mm,
there are like temporal consequences to not getting proper, state approval for baptisms. And
wild.
this comes up typically when there's a dispute between parents or things like that.
Okay, okay, well, that's a little different. I can
Yeah.
understand like who has
Hmm.
custody and grandma wants to baptize their atheist grandson or
Hmm.
their atheist children's grandson, something like that. I can see that
Yeah.
being something that where law gets involved.
Right. Well,
Yes,
canon law handles it.
Yeah,
to be
well, the
fair.
canon law says not to. So yeah,
Yeah,
in that case.
exactly. So just
So
don't do that. But the point
right.
stands that yeah, no, the state tries to interfere even with baptism, and the state has interfered with communion as well. I mean, um, after 2020, anything is possible. Let's just put it that way.
Fair enough. Oh, I see what
Yeah.
you're saying. Yeah. I was thinking you're going to get back to like post Protestant rebellion, some of the laws
Oh,
that
I
happen
mean,
in different
true.
countries. I mean, but I think all sides agree that both sides went a little too far in suppressing one another. Or I shouldn't
Yeah,
even say both sides because there wasn't two sides. There was,
all
a
sides.
thousand
There's a lot.
sides. Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah.
sides. That's an exaggeration, but there was a lot of sides, and everyone
Mhm.
agreed the Anabaptists were bad. Otherwise, they're pretty much everyone's at each other's throats.
Even a lot of
Although,
the Anabaptists agreed that the other Anabaptists from the next town over were bad. So
I mean, I was a former Anabaptist. I grew up born and raised Mennonite, and or at
okay.
least one foot in the Mennonite Church. And
Hmm.
when I started studying Anabaptist history, I'm like, oh, this is why everyone wanted to kill the Anabaptists. Like they were basically the brown shirts or the Antifa of their day that
Uh-huh.
just like completely destroying cities. Not in the sense of like upending the political philosophy of the day, but they were literally going in and burning cities down and living in crazy polygamist sex cults, and just
Hmm.
yeah, it was a weird thing until John Menno got involved. Now John Menno onward, they put on a nice suit, they cleaned up their beards a little bit. Actually, they didn't, but you know what I'm saying. But
Metaphorically.
they metaphorically speaking,
Yeah.
Mennonites are known for their beards, especially the Amish. But
Hmm.
um, but yeah, they definitely got a lot cleaner after that. But
Hmm.
pre John Menno Mennonites were something of a nightmare, a scourge on society. But
Hmm.
anyway, I digress here. Uh,
Yeah.
the
So
distinctions,
something I want to go back to,
yeah,
if we're still talking on the sort of history of the church and the history of what leads to something like distributism, um, it often gets conflated, distributism that is, often gets conflated or equated to Catholic social teaching, but usually when Catholic social teaching gets the all capital letters treatment, when it's thought of as if it were a an official publication or something like that, rather than just a sort of gradual collection of doctrines. So what do we make of the alleged connection between Catholic social teaching and distributism?
yeah. I mean,
Because I think
I
there
think
is some connection to it. To be fair
oh
to
for sure.
the defenders, there is.
Well, I mean, Rerum Novarum is their favorite document, Pope Leo the
Hmm.
13th,
Hmm.
which is becoming more relevant now, I guess, now that we have a Leo the 14th.
Right, right.
But I read Rerum Novarum several times over, and
Hmm.
I see exactly what the distributists are pointing to.
Right.
The problem with the distributist hermeneutic is that there's kind of two halves to Rerum Novarum, and the first half is this Lockean, and it is Lockean by all accounts. Anyone who studied John Locke, two treaties, I don't know if you read the two treaties, but
Hmm.
he
Hmm.
he he basically plagiarizes and summarizes John Locke's two treaties into a half encyclical and
He baptizes
a
John Locke because he needed it,
yes
to be fair.
indeed,
And I
oh
think that that's
fully.
actually something that the sort of Catholic social teaching does pretty well, is it takes these secular ideas from the Enlightenment and kind of separates the wheat from the tare, right? And gets rid of the well, if you look at John Locke specifically, if you know Pope Leo got rid of the explicitly anti-Catholic stuff, but kept a lot of the brilliant political insights, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
yeah, and but well, the first half is a very full-throated endorsement of Lockean way of thinking, and
Mhm.
even going so far as to saying property rights are inviolable. Private property, the right to private property is inviolable, which I know. distributors will then want to say, well, inviolable doesn't mean absolute, but you know what? The same language is
Yes,
used in
it does.
canon
Be
law.
quiet.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. In
exactly.
canon law, the seal of confession is inviolable. So
Uh-huh.
should we say that that's not absolute? It's there's exceptions we can where a priest can tattle. I mean, no, it's inviolable. Inviolable means inviolable. It means absolute, and
Hmm.
it's very clearly trying to mean absolute in the context. And he's
Hmm.
actually quoting the Catechism of Trent, which also says property rights are inviolable. So that wasn't
Hmm.
a new teaching. It was 500 years old at that point, or 400 years old at that point
Hmm.
where the idea of inviolable property rights has it goes back. That really goes back to Judaism before Christianity. They had
Right.
a pretty strong concept of property rights even in Judaism. But because the whole the Ten Commandments thing, the lesser known, that thou shalt not steal,
Oh yeah. A lot of
it's
people forget about
like
that one.
you can't have thou shalt not steal if you don't have property rights. Like
Right.
there's got to be some concept of property rights to have thou shalt not steal. Now that doesn't necessarily mean absolute property rights. I'm sure I'll grant that, but already you have the makings of private property in the Mosaic Law, and that only gets more solidified as the Jewish scriptures continue. So going back to Rerum Novarum, excuse me, the second half is very much where you're going to get the distributist way of thinking, where in the second half of Rerum Novarum, the you kind of have this foreign aid and reasonable wages or living wages being employers need to give living wages and there has to be a, a focus on the poor, and there's a lot
Hmm.
of very distributist or even socialist sounding language in the second half. And if you just take the second half and say here's Rerum Novarum, I understand exactly where distributors get their thinking from. The problem is that the encyclical was written the way it was for a reason. The entire first half builds up a very libertarian understanding of private property and acquisition of wealth and whatnot, and affirmation of basically capitalism. Although I don't like that term, and I don't think he would have used that term either. But you
No,
know,
he certainly didn't like the term. Like I think
yeah,
explicitly
well, it's a
in
derogatory term. The fact
yeah,
that we've embraced it in modern days is kind of a accident of history. But
right.
capitalism is such a nebulous word. But a free market type of economic or type of
Hmm.
thinking he was endorsing in the beginning of the letter. So everything in the second half has to be interpreted through the first half because he wrote the first half first so that you would interpret the second half in light of the first half. And
Hmm.
so this endorsement of private property that is very, very strongly endorsed in the first half should lead one to read the second half as saying, okay, like we have to have living wages, we have to help out poor countries, we have to, you know, keep a focus on the poor and help the poor out or preference treatment for the poor in the context of in ways that don't violate private property. And
Right.
if we're going to have this mass redistributionary system, that's going to violate private property.
Hmm.
And the private property is what society is built on, he says. So we have to interpret the latter half in a sort of libertarian way, and that's to say, if you're a Catholic employer, pay a good wage. If you're a person with wealth on your hands and you can give money to the poor or to people in other nations that need it, go ahead and do that. Give that foreign aid. But it's not saying the government needs to steal from people to give to others, like that quote we read. It's that's not that's
Exactly.
not the
Yeah. And bringing it back to the Chrysostom quote, I think that's particularly relevant to that particular hermeneutic that you're talking about, sort of reading Rerum Novarum in light of itself.
right,
Because if you read it as looking at this basic outline of more or less, as you say, more or less lock-in private property norms, and then what we get next, I think the best way of reading the whole thing in continuity is to say here are the grounding principles. Private property is inviolable. It forms the basis of social interaction, all of the good things that it does. And then the second half is here is what we as Christians ought to do with that property.
right, right,
And
exactly.
it provides these further norms that are not per se enforceable, and to enforce them would ultimately violate them and would violate not only not only would it violate the private property thing, but it would also wind up violating the principles of charity that we wind up talking about, right? And
Yep.
that's actually, I'll say, that little turn there, that uh, that if the state is going to use force to enforce private property, and then noticing that, well, wait, hold on, using force in order to enforce private property winds up violating property rights in order to,
Mhm.
extract taxation, maintain a monopoly, et cetera, et cetera, all the things that states do. Seeing this little contradiction in there, which I think that is, first of all, that's one of the things that pushed me away from the sort of night watchman state, minimalist, or like
Yeah.
minarchist libertarian into anarchism or anarcho-capitalism,
Right.
if you want to call it that. Um, but then also, I think there's the seeds of that, even in Catholic social teaching, because there are a lot of proscriptions against um, state actions that would violate the principles that they're supposed to be defending. And if you just sort of follow that through, you're there. So yeah, I think that
Yeah.
yeah, it's more complicated than we it's more complicated and more holistic than we want to give it credit for, than we often want to give it credit for. Um, but then we also have, okay, so then, okay, maybe this is great, but I want to anticipate an objection from the distributists. Um, okay, what about this? Instead of reading the second half of Rerum Novarum, sorry, this sort of second half in light of the first as a sort of expansion upon the first, what if it is more like this? If it's, this is important, right? The Lockean property rights, this is important, but here are some more fundamental, more important principles that we have to keep in mind, that have to undergird that are going to have to take precedence to that. What if it's a this, but also, or this, or a this,
Yeah.
but more fundamentally this? What do you say to that sort
And
of thing? Because I get that
I,
argument a
I've
lot.
I've received that objection as well, that we have to interpret the first half in light of the second half. And uh, I would say it's not how people generally speak.
Mhm,
A good rule. I play a lot of board games. You can see my board games behind me here. You
mhm,
know, I have two different kinds of people who explain the rules of a board game. You have the people who are um, they're going to explain the rules like this. Okay, this game is really fun, and there's an exception to the rules where sometimes you can steal from other players, but you can't always. But there's an exception where sometimes they can steal back, but they can't always steal back. And sometimes you can do it, and you're a half hour into them trying to explain the rules to you, and you still don't know what the actual rules are, only a bunch of exceptions to the rules.
mhm.
And
Yep, I know
you know,
exactly the type. I've
nothing
been the
worse
type
than
before.
learning a yeah, nothing worse than learning a
I've
board game
accidentally
from
done
something like
that.
that. Oh yeah, I fall into it myself. I try to be very intentional though. It's like, okay, this
Mhm.
is the theme of the game because it's good to understand the theme. You're
Right.
playing a dark lord trying to take over a fantasy world,
Mhm.
or something like that. Explain the theme, and here's the thing. Now here's how you do it. The person who gets the most victory points wins. How do you get victory points? Here's how. So on and so forth. So you
Mhm.
kind
You
of
start with the more fundamental parts that are
explain what the
broad and
rules.
far-reaching, and then you go into the narrow and more specific stuff and
Exactly. And
applications of it. Right.
the church is a great teacher, and she tends to start with the more fundamental and
Mhm.
then goes into kind of the nuanced exceptions. That's why you have nuance as church history goes on, because we start with the more fundamental, and the fundamentals gotten more and more drilled out and hammered out. And as the fundamentals been hammered out, the
Mhm.
exceptions, the nuance has been then further clarified from there. But we still have that core fundamental at the back. And that can be hard when someone's like, okay, well, you have this exception where someone can be saved outside the church. Well, are you saying everyone outside the church is saved? Well, no, no, no. That's an exception. We don't start with that. We start with, you have to be a Christian to be saved. You have to be a
Mhm.
Catholic to be saved. Now here's the exceptions, but the fundamental is over here.
Right. That's
Um,
actually a great example, I think. Right, because when you know, when Jesus commends his disciples to go and baptize all nations, he didn't say go and hang all nations on the cross like Saint Dismas and hope that they, get it in the end. Like, no, he said, here's the
right.
rule. I can make exceptions because I'm God. You don't worry about that, right? And setting out the anyway, sorry about that, everybody. Um, we're back. So uh, talking about the sort of Catholic social teaching stuff, um, and the place that distributism may or may not have within it, I think it'd be a good thing to talk about uh, where. So we were talking about rights a little bit,
Mhm.
and especially in this context of the Chrysostom quote, and then or Chrysostom. I'm not sure how to wind up pronouncing it, but Saint John
I've heard
Chrysostom.
Chrysostom, but yeah, I've heard both ways,
I don't know
honestly.
why I say Chrysostom, but it's
There's a
habit, I
Chrysostom
suppose.
college around here, I think. So
That's
that's what
probably
everyone
right.
says. But
Um,
I don't know. I've heard it
yeah.
two or three different ways, and who
Then
knows?
again, there is a city in Florida called Saint Augustine, so whatever.
Yeah. And I've always pronounced it Augustine, but then I hear people say
It is.
Augustine. I'm like, I don't know,
It's
whatever.
Augustine. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not Augustine. Just like his mother's name is Monica with two N's, not with one N.
Okay.
Which is my younger daughter's name. It's
Yeah,
Monica
you
with
always see
two
with two
N's.
with one end.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
It's
well,
incorrect. You look at the
my name's the same.
manuscripts.
Yeah, my name's the same. Yeah, Philip. Everyone always tries to spell it with two L's. I'm like, look, yeah,
Hmm.
adding to scripture is a sin, and Philip in the Bible is who I'm named after, and he has
See,
one
there you
L.
go.
So,
There you go.
so yeah, you get in dangerous ground when you start adding two L's into that
Just
name.
you know, just check the original manuscripts. That's what you got to do. Anyway, so I want to talk about rights a little bit, right? Especially in this context of what does that mean, and um, in the especially in the context of the difference between this sort of this legal framework that's enforced by the state versus a more social framework of right and wrong. What should I do? So before we started streaming, you were talking about a several fold, at least four or maybe five-fold distinction of what we might mean by rights. So
Yeah,
if you want to go for it.
you often have, and what I actually was talking to a good friend recently, or not too long ago, about the idea of rights, and we were talking about libertarianism, and they said, well, you can't have a right to do wrong because wrong is never right.
Hmm.
And that hit me off guard. This is probably 5 years ago. It's just after the January 6th incident. So it's probably about 5 years ago now. But yeah, I took some time thinking about that and mulling over it. I'm like, I know there's something wrong here. I know that what she said sounded right. Like there's something true to it. You can't have a right to do wrong because wrong is never right. I mean, that sounds axiomatic. It sounds like it's flawless logic. But the more I thought about it, like, but it's not right. There's something doesn't sit right about that. And then I realized after thinking out for a minute, we're conflating the word right or I think conflating is the right term. Two different. It's spelled the same way, but it's two different concepts. And the analogy I came up with was
It's
uh,
equivocal, right? So
it's
it's an
equivocal. We're
equivocation.
equivocating. We're equivocating. And the
Hmm.
analogy I came up with was you can't have a right to turn left because left is never right. I mean, clearly that doesn't work, but it makes
Uh-huh.
sense. It makes sense. Like it sounds like it works. It sounds like it works because we use the same word for two different concepts, and that's why I started parsing out the different types of rights I could think of. And obviously the direction right. You mentioned correctness before the stream. You know, 1 plus 1 equals 2 is correct. 1 plus 1 equals 4 is incorrect. So you could be
Hmm.
right in the sense that you got the right answer. Now, if I say 1 plus 1 equals 4, I didn't sin, at least not in normal circumstances. My math is
I
bad.
mean,
I
assuming you're
suck at
not
math.
lying, right?
Yeah, assuming I'm not
Or
lying,
deceiving
I just
someone or
suck at
something.
math. Yeah, it's just I'm
Right.
just bad at math. It's not a lie. Um, so you can have, just factual correctness. You can have the direction. Then there's a moral right where, it is right for me to give to the poor. It is right for me to uh not do sin. Okay, these
Hmm.
are moral rights, and it is wrong for me to, or sinful for me to steal from someone. Then there's social rights. You have no right to say that about my wife. You have no right to ask me about that aspect of my personal life. There's a social right. Now, of course, you do have right to say things like that if you want to, but or ask questions that might be socially faux pas, but it's a social right. You have no right to say that socially. Then there's political rights. That's what you call them. I'm trying to think of a better term than political right. I feel like that I've this one gotten stuck on for quite some time because I feel like there could be a better term than political right, but that's the best I've come up with myself and best you seem to say too. So for now, we'll stick with political rights, which is more of like a negative right because you have positive and negative rights too. Positive right is someone owes you something. If I have a right to water, that means someone somewhere has to give me water whenever I want it. If I have a right to healthcare, someone somewhere has to give me healthcare whenever I want it. If we're talking about a political positive right, if we're talking a political negative right, it's to say that, okay, I have a right to bear arms and no one can take my firearms away from me. It's a negative right. It's not that I have a right to be given firearms whenever I want them.
Mhm.
Um, it's that I have a right to keep the firearms that I may happen to acquire. But if I don't acquire any, well, no harm, no foul. So
Right.
yeah,
And see, that's
political
where
rights.
I think that's a phenomenal distinction to make, especially that one right there, because I'll see this often where this is really common with Bernie Sanders supporters I've found. Maybe it's because of the particular way they talk or the way they think or something. But they when they'll jump in between these definitions of rights, especially in terms of positive negative. This political right versus maybe more like a social right, maybe something in terms of I have it would be right for me to have it, right? Something like
Yep.
that. Where they'll say things like, "Well, we have a right to health care, right? Because we have a right to derive from our right to live, our right to life." And so therefore we have a right to maintain our health and to continue living. So we have a right to health care. And the best response to this that I'll often see, I've seen this more and more now, is saying, okay, I agree. We have a right to healthcare. We have a right to buy it. Like, no, we have a right to have it. Okay, cool. So you'd agree we have a right to bear arms? We have a right to firearms? When are you going to buy me a new gun?
Right. I seen
Because,
that.
yeah.
So
Mhm.
someone memed that they were dialoguing on Facebook or something with a Bernie Sanders
Yeah.
supporter,
Well,
and
I've seen it
uh,
happen in comment sections and I've participated in the dialogue before.
it's
It's
wonderful.
it's
It's
a trap they can
wonderful.
fall into. Hmm.
Um, I'd love to remake that meme with me and a Bernie Sanders person in the wild. But
Hmm.
yeah, that's funny. And yeah, you're absolutely right. They equivocate the term rights to get things that aren't actually rights in the sense they're trying to make them. Now, I know some libertarians will say that positive rights are complete fiction, and I wouldn't
Hmm.
agree with that. I don't know what you would say to that, but I think that you know, negative rights would include the right to contract. So if you and
Hmm.
I create a contract that on you give me $100 and by such and such a date, I will provide you with I'm hypothetically a woodworker and I'm good at making chairs. I will
Hmm.
provide you with a handmade wooden chair within the allotted time period if you give me $100. Well, okay, now you
Hmm.
have a positive right to my chair that I've made, or vice versa. If I've made the chair and you haven't given me the money yet, I have a positive right to your $100 since I've given you the chair.
Hmm.
So there's, I think in that sense, but it's a positive right is a sort of is a man-made right that comes out through
Hmm.
contract law. It is not something that one has
Right. So
naturally.
I think that the distinction we can make there is the negative rights um, are intrinsic or innate,
Yes, indeed.
and therefore are universal and inviolable, whereas positive rights are conditional. They're conditional and circumstantial, say.
Yep.
Right? You might have a positive right to something, but only because of certain really specific conditions. Typically, you've entered into a contract, or even say, right, if someone has suppose that I steal something from you, right?
Hmm.
I steal your car.
Right.
You have a right to, well, first of all, your car back, right? Which is a right that it's a positive right. It's a claim that you have on me, and then also
Yes, indeed.
recompense for harm done, for inconvenience, for
Yeah.
you have a right to be repaid for something, not because you entered into an agreement or anything, just because I did something to you, right?
Right. And then the biblical precedent for that would be the restoration sevenfold in the Old Testament.
Right.
If a thief
Hmm.
steals, he doesn't just return what was stolen, but sevenfold. Now, yeah, whether or not that's always going to be the right amount, I do believe there are exceptions for, how that would work. But yeah,
Hmm.
it's the principle though was that strictly giving back what was stolen is not sufficient to
Right.
create a system of to create a state of justice.
Right. Both for disincentivizing stealing, but then also for fully making the victim whole, which would be honestly should be
Right.
the sort of focus of justice per Rothbard.
And and
Rothbard's absolutely right
and
about this. But
for anyone that has any questions about that, just consider, okay, well, the time without that property loss. Let's say it's a car you stole.
mhm,
Okay, like the example you use. Okay, well, let's say I had to go with a week without my car. Okay, well, maybe I lost a week from work for that. Well, how much money did I make it work that week, or would I have made it work that week? How
mhm,
how much time did I have to spend getting my car back by talking to the police and going to court? And so these are
mhm.
all things that, like, time is money, so to speak. So
Or at
this
least
time
time can be
lost.
exchanged for money. There you go.
Yes, time has value. And
Mhm,
so, by virtue of making me spend a week of my life fighting to get my car back, uh,
mhm,
that value has been stolen from me. And I know the right often will poo-poo on the psychological damages, but, like, you're gonna be stressing about that for a while afterwards. Okay, well,
right.
crap, that was yeah, a stressful week of my life, and yeah, maybe
Mhm,
you're kind of taking a week to kind of get over it too after that. I mean, there is some sort of psychological damage there too that can happen as a result that may require restitution also. Now, that's hard to quantify, but I think we can all agree that there is damage there that may need to be recompensed.
mhm. Side note that this actually brings up to my mind, at least, if we're accepting here the premise, I think we should, that time is valuable and time without something is time that I could have spent with the thing and therefore is more valuable when I have the thing. And so therefore I should receive compensation for being without something. This starts very quickly to justify rent. This starts very quickly to justify interest.
Yes.
Because instead of, like, suppose instead of stealing a car, I stole $10,000 from you.
Yeah.
And you were planning to do something with that $10,000, but now you have to wait until some
And
later
look,
time.
as we'll use Jesus' example in the parable of the talents. As
Hmm.
simple
Hmm.
as the interest. The wicked servant was punished because at the very least he could have put it in the bank and earned some interest for the master. When the master
Hmm.
came back, he would have his talent plus some interest. So
Right.
for anyone that says interest is always bad, is always usurious, I mean, Jesus seems to be endorsing interest right then and there. But which
Hmm.
there's two different parables that say that. Um, but putting that aside, um, there, there there is some recognition there that a lack of interest is that the interest is a good thing there. I'm
Right.
sorry, I derailed myself here, but what I was
Yeah, yeah.
saying there, but
But I think it's an interesting aside because also, and I'll say it at least, a lot of the time, distributists will also be some of the most vocal opponents of interest that they'll refer to as usury,
yes,
right?
and not all interest
Which,
is usury in
right.
scripture. I mean, you have interest being talked of as a positive thing in scripture. You
Hmm.
have it throughout church history being spoken of as an acceptable thing. Even in the Old Testament, uh, and in the New Testament, Paul gives an exception for interest being acceptable in some circumstances, if I remember
Hmm.
correctly. I have to look at that passage, but there is a passage where he says, "Lend without interest, except in certain circumstances." I forget the passage for
Yeah,
that. I have to look at that.
I'll say there's some fascinating political and economic conclusions that you can draw from Jesus' life and miracles and parables. There's
Yeah,
that one. There's the I will always point to the multiplication of loaves and fishes as a justification for data piracy, copying. Um,
of the IP laws of the
right.
fishermen, though.
I did actually take that example from Jeffrey Tucker from that article I was talking about earlier, where he points out that the miracle was Jesus rendering bread and fish in that narrow circumstance non-scarce, and so there was nothing wrong with sharing it indefinitely, right?
Yes.
And it became scarce at the end of it, right? Because there were a certain number left at the end. The other one that always comes to mind is the parable of the treasure in the field, where you come to be aware that there's a treasure in some field, and so you sell everything that you have to buy the field. Right. Now, clearly this has a spiritual meaning, right? Spiritual notion, but also this seems to be an endorsement of asymmetric information in trade, which was a big deal under discussion by medieval ethicists. Like Anselm talks about it a bunch. Boethius, I think, talks about it. Bonaventure, I know, talks about it. Aquinas talks about it. Scotus just wholeheartedly approves and says, "Yep, asymmetric information's a-okay." But yeah, that's another one of those fascinating things. That, no,
But
that's not fraud. It's
yeah,
just asymmetric information.
Now, just if you could flesh that term out, asymmetric information.
Mm,
What
right.
do you mean by that?
So I know something that you don't, and I leverage that to my economic advantage, right?
Okay.
You own a field. I know that it's got buried treasure in it. You don't know that. And so I will pay the sort of expected market value for a field
Mm, okay.
rather than expected market value for a field with treasure in it, rather than
So
me paying for what I know it is. I'm
let's
paying
parse that
you
a
for
little
what you
bit.
think it's worth.
A real life example that I think anyone who's bought a used car has experienced. You buy a car
Mm,
and yeah, it's a used car and you get into it, it's all cleaned out, but then you find in the dashboard there's some money stored, like maybe some coins for tolls.
mm,
That wasn't what you bought. You didn't buy that. But like,
right.
is we're talking about pennies, so obviously it
It's a
wouldn't be
little
a
extra, you know?
yeah, it wouldn't be a mortal sin to take a dollar necessarily, when you've
Yeah.
driven an hour to get there and now back, because it's too much hassle to get it back to them. But like, it could be, whether it's a sin at all to keep it is an interesting question, and I've
I
pondered
think
on
certainly
that.
not, right?
So it
Because
sounds like you'd
you
say not.
Right, I would say not. Well, even if, say, you go on a test drive and you look, and in the glove box there is something particularly valuable, right? Something
Okay.
that will increase the value of the car, right?
Okay.
Or something like that. I don't know, jewelry or something that wouldn't. Jewelry's tough because usually it has sentimental value, but let's just say, a bag of gems.
Yeah, sure.
The dealer didn't notice. And yeah, this would increase the value of the car by a few hundred, maybe a couple $1,000s. And so you really want to buy it so you can get a hold of that bag of gems. Now,
Mm,
do you have to tell the dealer, hey, by the way, there's this bag of gems in here that I also want. Hey, does that come with the car? No, you don't have to say that. If
okay.
they don't take it out, it's not theirs. It's part of it comes with
And
the
that is the
package.
parable of the field. That is the exact example of the parable
Exactly.
of the field.
Yeah.
No, no, let's change the analogy here.
Hmm.
Let's say that I am buying the car from an individual,
Hmm.
a stranger. We'll start with a stranger. Uh, you know,
Hmm.
uh, guy I don't know that I found on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace to sell a used
Hmm.
car. Would the same principle apply, or is there some duty there to an individual versus a business?
Yes, I think the same principle would apply, but there might be a caveat that especially if they informed you after the fact that, hey, I forgot my bag of jewels. This is getting absurd.
Yeah,
But if I or let's just be with something more realistic. I forgot my watch in the glove compartment. I think you have an obligation to bring it back,
yeah,
right? Because
okay,
if they knew of it but did not intend to sell it, not just didn't intend to sell it, but intended not to sell it. I think that's an important
yeah,
difference. It's not willing versus willing against, which is another sort of medieval decision
yeah.
in action theory,
Okay, that
where
makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, you can simply have no particular will for something, like if you don't know it's there. That's very different from willing against, or the Latin volere contra, right? Or nole is the contraction of it. To will against something is to will the opposite of it. So if I left my watch in that car that I just sold, and I call the guy who I just sold it to and said, "Hey, I left my watch. Can I swing by and pick it up?" And he says, "No, you sold it as part of the car." And I will very reasonably say, "No, no, that wasn't part of what I sold
Yeah.
you. I did not intend to sell that." Right. Whereas if I, if he says, "Hey, did you know that there was a bag of gems in this car?" And I say, "Wow, I didn't know that. Can I have them? Can I have them back?" Very clearly, I had no will in the matter whatsoever. So there, it's really ambiguous. But I would say it would be perfectly legitimate for the buyer to keep it.
Okay.
Might be courteous to, say, "Hey, you didn't know they were there. It's a surprise to me too. I'll give some of them to you, and we'll split the difference." Right? That'd be probably the more courteous thing to do. But I don't think there's a
Hmm.
moral obligation to.
Yeah. Now I was gonna think of like an example of like uh let's say you sold me a car and it was a Jeffrey Tucker's first book, first edition autographed,
Mhm,
happened to be in
mhm.
the glove compartment, and maybe it
By the
is.
way, I regret to this day not picking up a signed first edition of which one was it that just came out? It was Jetson's World. It just came out when I saw him in person. So
Oh,
it's a really good book. But I didn't pick up a signed copy. I should have. But oh well.
Pity. We all have those regrets.
We
Someone
do.
told me I should get on the Bitcoin wagon when it was about to hit $100 a coin,
Oh yeah, I
and
know. What
I had
at
enough to
that
buy two.
talk, this is gonna kill me. At that talk with Jeffrey Tucker, I was this close to convincing him to sell me a Bitcoin for $100. A whole one.
Right. Well, that's the same thing. You're talking like 2010, 2012, somewhere in that
Yeah.
range.
No, he was
And
he was personally on board for this. It's just I didn't have a wallet set up yet, so he couldn't send it to me. I was like, "Ah,
that's
man,
hilarious.
I was
That's
I was this
hilarious.
close to being set for most of my life. But no, I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
have so signed books. I have this one, which is Tom Wood's "How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization." That one is this one the signed one? Yeah, signed.
Nice.
Yeah,
I don't have that physical. I have it audio and Kindle, but
it's a great.
it's a good book. It's a
I've
good book.
I've assigned chapters to that to chapters of that to my classes before. It's
Oh, good, good. It's good
particularly
reading.
brilliantly relevant.
Um, the but so let's say I had your copy of Tom Wood's How the Catholic Church Built the Western
Right.
Civilization. You didn't know it was there. You forgot you had it even, and I find it in the
Hmm.
glove compartment. You and I being friends, I think would have a little bit more of a weight on that. That I find this in the glove compartment. I would say, in my mind, it seems like charity would demand that I say, "Hey, Vincent, you left this in your glove compartment. You might not have known you
Or at
had it. You might
least
have forgotten you
ask,
had it.
hey, did you mean to
Did
give
you
this
mean
as
to leave this
sell
here?"
this as
Yeah,
part of the car, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, I
it
think
seems
that
like
would
on a
be I think that would be an obligation under friendship rather than under
yes.
justice, per
Yeah,
se.
friendship and family, I would say, would probably be
Right.
well. I think friendship and family are a matter of justice, though. You want to keep good relations with your friends and family. And I think there's
We should make a distinction here, though, between justice and charity again, keeping that
okay.
in mind.
Oh,
Right.
please do. Yeah.
Um, right. So justice is, I would limit it to strictly enforceable obligations, right? That last category of political rights.
Okay.
Those are the strictly
Strictly
negative or
enforceable. Okay.
contractual conditional positive rights that are strictly enforceable, right? If I don't give it to you, then you have a right to, you have a right to make me. You can come and just take it, right?
Yeah.
Or I forget which way the example was going, but you get the idea, right? Or I could come and take it,
Yeah. No,
right?
that's fair. And in that case, yeah, the question would be, could you just come and take it? And I think that there'd be definitely social pressures we could put on
Hmm.
each other in the event that that happened to either one of us.
Right.
Assuming we're friends of the same parish, we're a local community, we're part of the same community, at that point it becomes easy to put social pressures on one another for the person who is the quote unquote guilty party of the social faux pas. But
Huh.
um, but
That's
not
actually really
necessarily.
interesting. That's an interesting point for a slightly disconnected reason. So I mentioned earlier how pre-modern thinkers tended to conflate the state and society and tended to conflate politics with what they called politics, which I just realized I didn't really expand upon. Um, Pre-modern thinkers think of politics as the sum total of social arrangements and organization, right? How it
Okay.
is that we live together as a community. Right? That's what Aristotle meant by it. And I have to think that the situation that you just described, where we're friends, we're part of the same community, we're sort of part of the same parish, we know each other, we know a lot of the same people who know each other as well. We're part of an interwoven community. That is precisely how Aristotle describes the polis, which
Hmm.
he describes as not only the ideal political unit or political union, but the only natural political union and the only stable political union.
Yeah. Oh, for
Which
sure.
is a society in which all citizens know each other with a bond of friendship, philia.
Hmm.
And so uh, I guess I can kind of see now, I hadn't thought of this before, but I can kind of see now under that, using this example or examples like this, how you can maybe start to confuse or start to conflate or start to blur the line between legal rights and social rights, so to speak, or
Hmm.
political rights and social rights.
Which is why you have to have terminology for them. If you don't have a
Hmm.
name for it, it's hard to identify that it exists, or at least it can be.
Hmm.
I think it's a myth. I don't know if it's a myth or not, but you hear that a lot of times that people say like in certain cultures the card Buddha doesn't exist.
Hmm.
I believe that's a myth, but I do know that there are shades. I've seen studies. Business Insider read an article a little while back about a study that certain tribes in Africa have like 100 different shades of green they can name on a whim,
Hmm.
and when they showed uh, Americans these spectrum of colors, we all just any American may show for the most part will just see one, maybe two shades of green,
Right.
and when they
And
show it
can't
to
differentiate between them. Yeah, I've run this exercise
when
with
they show it to like a
yeah.
yeah, they
It's
show it
actually
to
funny. I've run this exercise with uh students of different nationalities,
okay,
and I'll tell you, uh I don't remember where the lines sort of shook out, but there was a noticeable difference between students from certain cultures and backgrounds versus others, depending on how many different shades they could point out, and also
yeah.
linguistic origin was another one too, which kind of goes to your point. Yeah, I think that
Yeah,
there's
so
something certainly to that.
they have a name for it, so they can identify it, and so I think there's
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
helpful to. Well, interestingly too, women have a higher spectrum than men of color range, generally
Hmm.
speaking, at least. And women also have oh, that's not purple, that's not red, that's magenta, whatever. Or that's not
Right.
burgundy, it's
Right.
magenta. Yeah, so okay, whatever. Okay, but they do
Yeah.
see this
Yeah.
color difference that we don't. They have names for it that they recognize because they more clearly see the difference.
Hmm.
But
I mean, I use the example of, because I talk about this in terms of in what I'm teaching epistemology with respect to what's called epistemic virtue, which is the skill of being able to know. Um, where I don't know dog breeds like at
okay,
all. I'm really bad with dog breeds. Partially just because I don't like dogs really. I'm a cat person, always have been, and partially just because I
anathema.
can't keep them straight. Can't remember it. I just can't remember them. Um, and so when I see a dog, I see a dog, right? But when my wife sees that very same animal, she sees a terrier or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
Pick a dog, right? She sees a specific thing. I just see a general thing because I don't know what the fine-grained distinctions are. I don't have that clear at the forefront of my mind.
yeah,
The other example I like to use is perfect pitch. Right? If I play a note, if you have perfect pitch, you know what note it is. You can hear that. If you don't, you can't.
yeah,
Or th so that one might not be teachable, but others are, right? Intervals. So if I play a chord, you might be able to determine, well, that's a major seventh. If you know your music theory. But if you don't, you might just say, sounds nice, right?
yeah.
There's differences there, and a lot of it, you're right, comes down to whether we are familiar with the terms and the
Yep.
distinctions. And
And,
without that
and going
terminological distinction,
far
it's
that
fuzzy.
analogy, you're playing a C or a D chord, you
Hmm.
know, one who doesn't know music very well might say, "Oh, I hear the difference," but they don't
Hmm.
necessarily know what the difference is. They can't identify it clearly. And same here. One hearing these terms of different kinds of rights and obligations or negative rights, whatever duties. These things. One that's not familiar with this may intuitively to some degree see there's some differences but not be able to identify it, and until you can clearly identify it, until you can clearly articulate it, it is very easy to conflate and to
Hmm.
the word you used. I keep saying conflate, equivocate.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Hmm.
easy to equivocate terms, and I mean a political right is not the same as a social right, and a political negative right is not the same as a political positive right, and a moral right is not the same as a directional right. Then and you need to
Hmm.
know what all the differences are and have terms for them so that you can properly identify and name them and distinguish when each apply and when each don't apply. So yeah,
Hmm.
for sure. Um,
Yeah. So the way I usually will line it up in terms of like what is a right, and I find that in terms of a political right, um, the way that I usually will formulate this in such a way as to make perfectly clear what we're talking about in terms of, the use of violence in the organization of society, in terms of the modern political question, is to say that I have a right to do something is to say that it would be unjust of you to violently stop me from doing it.
yes, yeah, a
That's all
negative
we
right.
mean.
Yeah, to say you have a negative right would be to say you'd be unjust for you to stop it for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's exactly
I,
how I
I
would
think we
define
could,
negative
by
right.
analogy, at least say the same of a positive right. So if I have a positive right to do something, um, it mean if I have a positive right to something, that means that it would be justified for me to use violence to acquire it.
And that I would question. It would depend on the terms of the contract for one. And I have thought about this to some
Mhm.
degree. Does the con So let's say, go back to the analogy of the chair. You've built me a chair. I promise you $100. One of us doesn't
Mhm.
fulfill. It's not necessarily that we have the right to go and use violence against that person, but there does seem to be some kind of perhaps you could take back what was given or refuse what was
Mhm.
given. Um, and we see this
Well,
in contracts
well,
all.
well, hold
Always
on,
problem
because take back what was given. That I would
would
qualify
still be
that as
force. No,
violence.
you're right. You're
Yeah.
right. Um,
Maybe force is better than violence, we should say. Maybe we should say force
yeah.
if we're being
Now,
more precise.
here's an example where it gets a little muddy. Let's say I promised you a chair. You promised me $100. I build the
Hmm.
chair. You decide you don't want the $100 anymore. Or you don't want you decide you don't want the chair anymore. I mean to say.
Hmm.
Well, at this point now, I've already spent the time and they were building the chair. But I mean, in our society, you can do that. I mean, you go and order something built to order, and
Hmm.
you can renege to the money's exchanged usually.
Right.
Now there are some contracts that will specifically say otherwise, but if the contract's not there, typically if you go to if you go to your local Wawa or your local whatever your convenience store is that sells sandwiches, and order a
Hmm.
sandwich and say, "Oh, sorry, I forgot my wallet." You can walk out and not pay, and the sandwich stays there, and you don't owe them anything.
Right.
Generally, it's considered a social faux pas, but if you decide you don't want to pay and not pick the food, there's no criminal act that's had taking place. They can't
Right.
force
So
you to give the
maybe you're
money.
being rude or maybe you're forgetful, right? It
Yeah,
may be genuinely non-culpable, but you're right there. I think that would have to fall under social rights, right?
yeah, it seems like a social right
Unless
there
the
until
contract's explicit, like you said.
unless the contract's explicit. If it's a now that being said, I know common law has determined if I say, for example, and this is the example I read about recently, where a grandmother promised to pay her granddaughter's college.
Hmm.
The granddaughter went to college. Then she paid for all the college and got the grades the grandmother said she'd have to get to have the college paid for. And the
Hmm.
grandmother decided, I'm not paying for your college after all anyway. And the daughter took the grandmother to court and
Hmm.
won the case because the grandmother admitted, yeah, I had promised it. There was nothing written, there's no contract, and that was the grandmother's case. But the court said, well, you made a verbal promise. She wouldn't have gone to college and paid for all this, this massive debt if you hadn't promised her that you'd pay for it if she got the grades. And she got the grades, so
Hmm.
pay up. And so there is, and that's a common law principle. I think that comes from the natural law that if this goes back to another example to help me illustrate this is uh the same example I use for abortion is
Hmm.
if I invite you onto my property and let's say I have a big field and I lead you out into this field, we're walking back and forth in meandering directions as we go through this field, and I say, hold on, I'll be right back, you wait exactly here. And I run off the field a ways and I yell over to you, by the way, that's a minefield. The only way you're getting off that minefield is if I tell you exactly how to get off of it.
Hmm.
Okay, if you injure yourself trying to get off that minefield by stepping on a mine, I am morally culpable for that and legally liable for that because I've led you into a position now where you are likely going to get seriously hurt or die if you if I don't help you off, I don't give you ease. So I have a
Hmm.
positive duty to get you off that minefield now. Um, that's the analogy I use for why natural law prohibits abortion, because once you've created a person, you have a positive duty to take care of them. Because if you don't,
Hmm.
they're going to be seriously worse off or even die. But use that analogy for this circumstance. You put someone through 8 years of college without paying for it when you
Hmm.
promised you would. Now they're in $100,000 of debt. Well, okay, you put them in that position by promising them something, but then if it's something that's a non-injurious or not significantly injurious, the chair I can always sell to someone else. Yeah, maybe you're not going to buy
Hmm.
that chair for $100, but the next guy to walk up that wants one of my chairs, because I sell chairs for a living, I'll just give it to
Yeah.
him. And no money
I
lost for
might
me.
say in a circumstance like that, it might matter how reasonably quickly you could turn around and sell it, right? Because if you sell like if you do custom work and you're not likely to find a new customer within say 6 weeks, right? Then maybe I don't owe you the full value of the chair because you can still sell it. But
Yeah.
maybe I owe you compensation for the 6 weeks when you're trying to find a new customer, something like that,
Yeah.
right? So again,
Potentially.
if
Yeah.
we can fiddle around with this, and I do think that I think that probably would be a matter of a legal or juridical or political right.
Yeah. Then again, and I think this is why businesses don't
Still
press this.
conditional, but
It's bad business. Generally speaking, a business
right.
is going to say, you know what, I'll sell it to someone in 6 weeks. It sucks having this on the floor in the meantime, but better that and have a returning customer later than to do a lawsuit and then makes my business look
Right.
bad and no one's happy with me. So I
Hmm.
think that's why businesses don't press this, but
Right.
theoretically they could.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, realistically, no matter whether it's carried out, the old-fashioned way or through modern courts, violence is expensive, and that actually
right.
matters to practical law, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Um, Now, I mean, uh, the inverse of this is that it doesn't matter for the state, um, which gives a fascinating power imbalance, you should say.
Yeah.
Because of taxation, right? Uh, that you're paying either way, win or lose, in some way or another, if the state decides to press charges on you. But
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's
yeah,
true. Yeah. So I think that I think it pretty well covers rights. I do want to say
yeah,
we probably had to wind down soon just because we're getting late here. It's getting close to midnight.
right.
But
So I do want to hit a couple of things on this on
yeah,
the
yeah.
economic side. And that'll maybe be
And you're
where we
probably going to
wrap.
be better at the economics than I am. It's been 10 years since I've read
Okay.
an economics book, but
Well, I mean,
uh,
me too. So, I mean, maybe not quite 10 years, but most of the economics I've read recently are stuff that's more like philosophy anyway, or economics in one lesson I read again a
yeah,
couple of years
indeed.
ago. That's it. So, but in any case, though, so I think my biggest economic objection to distributism is that it isn't an economic theory.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It, I have pressed the distributists more than once for specifics, and
Hmm.
there's I don't want to insult my distributist friends. I have a lot of distributist friends, or at least a few, and I don't want to say that this is their motives, but when I talk online with distributists, it
Hmm.
often seems like it's a way to virtue signal that I
Hmm.
have a preferential treatment from the poor and the Democrats and Republicans don't. I have a sound economic system that the Democrats don't. I have preferential treatment that the Republicans don't. I have this, kind of the both end. They want to sound like
It's the
they're kind of
enlightened centrist
playing.
thing,
They're the enlightened centrist, and
right?
they love to talk about all the things they'd love to do for the poor and for the people in need and when you ask them how that exactly works, how are you going to do this without it being socialism? How are you going to do this without being guild socialism? They never really have any answers. They never really have a clear system. I'm told read this book or read that book, and I should read those books. I would like to read the uh whatever the book is the Distributist Manifesto that I can't remember
Hmm.
the guy's name.
It's not John Medall, is it? Or Medale, or
Well, no, I was
because
thinking of
he
the
blocked me on
original.
Facebook.
Oh boy. I was thinking of
I,
the original guy,
no, he's not. He's
Chesterton's.
actually contemporary. He's writing right now. Um,
Yeah, I was thinking of Chesterton's friend. He wrote the book on
oh,
heretics too.
Belloc,
Belloc, yeah,
Hilaire
Hilaire
Belloc.
Belloc.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
he
okay,
wrote he,
yeah,
wrote- he wrote a lot of interesting things aside from his economics, but
yeah,
apparently he has a big work that covers the economics of it all, and I'd like to read that at some point. But
yeah. I have. It's
okay,
most of it. I've read most of it. It's um. Let me just put it this way. The accusations that distributism is a breed of socialism are borne out if you read almost anything about it by Belloc.
okay,
He is almost an outright communist when it comes to economic policy,
and I know he said
including a
he.
lot of the state violence aspects. He's
I
all
recall
about
that
state violence.
he was a member of his local socialist party
Is he
and
really? I didn't know that.
he criticized them for not he criticized them heavily, but not because they were too socialist, but because they weren't socialist enough.
Oh
And
no.
now I'm not sure exactly. My one buddy from my local parish, he said, well, I shouldn't say my local parish, my closest ordinariate parish, which is an hour and a half from me
Mhm.
now. But he says that that's a little bit of a because that story gets anecdotally thrown around a lot by opposition opponents, and he says there's a little bit
Yeah.
more nuance to that, and I never actually got him to clarify that. But which not his fault, just time constraints and things on our conversations. But
Yeah.
uh the from what I've seen and read of him, it seems like it's a fair criticism. He seems like he was a socialist. And now the
Mhm.
one thing I will say is I do have a buddy who is in the anarcho-capitalist camp like ourselves, and he says that in the 18th century, not in the 19th century, socialism was actually because apparently Lysander Spooner was considered a socialist, and Spooner's
Kind of
prom
at the time, yeah, I think so.
yeah, so socialism, the one critique I have, perhaps of libertarianism from church teaching, is that socialism has been condemned, but I've
Hmm.
heard claims that socialism at the time of the 19th century would have actually been more akin to what we disbelieve as libertarians. But then I look at people like Belloc, who was a late 19th century socialist, and clearly he is a modern day left wing socialist. So
Hmm.
I know at some point the term socialism, this is the word liberal.
Yeah.
Liberal used to be a right wing thing, and now it's a left wing thing.
Yeah.
And the word is
It's so
flipped to mean something different. So at some point the
right.
word socialist flipped, and I'm not sure when, but
And I
when
mean,
it
I don't know, I wouldn't say it flipped, right? So both liberalism and socialism have been condemned by the church, but the church's condemnations are really specific, and
yes,
neither of
indeed.
them have anything to do with economics per se.
Yeah.
The condemnation of socialism is about the treatment of the person, right? That socialism legally prioritizes the collective at the expense of the individual,
Yeah.
and therefore dismisses the importance of individual human dignity. And that's the part of socialism that's condemned.
hmm
That and theft
Yeah.
that's
Because
mentioned
property
too.
rights, the affirmation
Yeah.
of property rights is also explicitly a
Um,
condemnation of
but
socialism.
but the more fundamental condemnation is and always has been in terms of the condemnation of socialism has been the mistreatment of the individual
Yeah.
and the denial of human dignity. Right?
And liberalism is the overemphasis on the individual at the denial of the social
Um,
higher or collective.
that and also associated with the heresy of Americanism that Pope Leo XIII also condemned. Um,
hmm
the uh, the the element of something like religious indifferentism, or at least uh, making religion subservient to the secular order or something like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
roughly speaking. And
Well,
again,
I
I
think
think
I
that these are points that the distributists make, and credit to them because it's a
yeah.
good point.
Well, because I would condemn libertinism too.
Hmm.
Libertinism
Oh
is
yeah, yeah.
definitely something we condemn. Now, you and I would probably both agree that drugs and prostitution and things like that should be legal, and we're right in line with Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastics who said the same thing. In fact, even in biblical Israel, a lot of these things were
Hmm.
legal because drugs weren't really a thing back then, but prostitution was, and it was never forbidden. Now, it's morally wrong, but it was never legally forbidden. And
Hmm.
the church has always condemned these things as morally wrong, and we should socially deal with those things through social means, but not through political
Yeah.
means, because it's not.
And that's the see that's always the missing aspect of it, right? The libertines will let me put it this way. The libertines and the sort of Puritans, if you will, the moralists, if you want,
Mhm.
the people who want to enforce every aspect of morality, they make the same error in opposite directions. I've always said this, that the libertines, so they both assume that justice and charity or justice and morality are the same thing. They're coterminous. That if something is wrong, then it should be enforced. It's just they take that conditional in opposite directions. The libertines say, well, if something is wrong, it should be enforced. Well, this shouldn't be enforced, therefore it must not be wrong.
Right.
Whereas the more Puritan
Yeah,
side,
they're
the
different
right
sides of the
wingers will
same
say
coin.
they'll say it the other direction, right? Yeah.
Right. No, you're
If
absolutely
it's
right.
if it's wrong, it should be prohibited. It's wrong, therefore prohibited, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's there's this category that both sides don't understand, that just because drugs are legal doesn't mean they're morally acceptable, and just because
Hmm.
all things are lawful but all things are not good for you, is kind of the to borrow from Paul.
Exactly. Yeah.
There are things that are it may be something that someone can do in the political law side of things, but it is still a moral sin. You still have to go to
Hmm.
confession for it, and if you're my friend and I see you doing this, I'm going to call you out on it, and or shame you or whatever. There's going to be some level of social retribution for this, or social
Hmm.
repercussions for this. If you're my employee, I might fire you. If you're my boss, I might quit. There's levels of like, okay, this might not be a moral or a political uh injustice, but it might be a moral evil to the point that it needs to be dealt with in some sense.
Hmm.
um uh
But you wouldn't, you know, beat somebody up and throw them in a cage about it, right?
exactly,
That's the
exactly.
difference. That would be
Yeah,
wrong. And going back to the point on rights, to say that, yeah, okay, fine, somebody has a right to, do drugs and be a prostitute. That is just to say that it would be wrong of someone else to coercively stop them from doing it.
yeah. Now, one argument, I want to see how you deal with this.
Hmm.
I'm going to put you on the spot here if you don't mind.
Okay,
But
let's go
one
for it.
argument I've heard is that okay, so let's say, and this is something interesting because I would generally say that suicide is a right that someone has. Like someone, if someone wants to
Mhm.
commit suicide, they're within their legal rights.
Mhm.
There can't be a law against suicide in a libertarian society. It seems to me, at least, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. On the other hand, though, I've heard
Maybe.
natural law claims that, okay, like let's say, and this is actually a police officer friend of mine gave this example actually of something that happened to him in real life. He was in someone's house. They called the police. I don't know why he was there, but he was there with his badge. He was there on duty, and the woman had a bottle of pills that she was about to chug. And legally, he said he is not allowed to stop her from doing that. But once she passes out, he is then obliged, or he should then begin doing life-saving actions. Get the
Mm.
pills out of her mouth that you can, CPR, the works, whatever you can do. And there's an assumption, there's a presumption of when someone is unconscious and in need of medical assistance, that they would want that medical assistance. Now, as long as they're consciously able to dissent, then you may not force that medical assistance upon them. But once they're unconscious and need, the presumption is upon their need is upon their consenting to it. So in that situation, he had to wait for them to go unconscious to help them. Um,
Interesting.
Now I think it was South Carolina, so malls might be different places. It might have been North Carolina. I don't know. It's the border, but
None of this is
uh,
legal advice. Just
not yeah.
yeah.
This is not a legal advice channel.
Right.
But yeah, the but I've looked at that. I've heard that principle articulated as a natural law principle in the past, and so when we talk about the rights and things, so what if someone, I've heard someone apply that before in saying, okay, well, once this person has gotten themselves uh drunk to a certain degree or high to a certain degree, and they're strung out on the street, at that point they're no longer in possession of their mental faculties the same way someone who is mentally handicapped is. And as
Mhm.
libertarians, we would say, okay, well, like if someone is not mentally capable of making decisions, like a child or like someone who is incapacitated in some way, obviously someone else can take responsibility for that individual. And so I look at that, well, can we treat people who are drunk and high to a certain degree in a similar way, or even take it another step further, addicted to a drug that they can no longer operate in society they can no longer operate in society in a uh, healthy way
Mhm.
because of their addiction. Even if they're not currently high, they're not making decisions of their own faculties. Can we say that person actually could be detained by virtue of the fact that they are not acting rationally? The same way a mentally handicapped person, an extremely autistic person or Down syndrome
Mhm.
person may not be acting rationally. They have caregivers that help them in that case until such a time as they're capable, if that time can ever come.
Interesting case. So, okay. First of all, to get at maybe a root principle here, I think that this is trying to approximate this whole you can help them if they're not capable of telling you no kind of thing,
Yeah,
which when you say it like that is a little moving on. Um,
fair
that's
enough.
not
That's okay.
that's not where we're going. But that that has some weird and certainly uncomfortable consequences from this idea that that we should be able to presume what someone would want, but only if they're not capable of saying no. That's weird. But I think that this is trying to approximate a natural law principle about what someone could rationally pursue, right? Um, so it is, uh, broadly speaking, it is impossible to will suicide, fully, consciously, and deliberately,
Okay.
um, because it is self-contradictory. To will suicide is to will the end of one's capacity for action.
Okay.
It is to will not to will in this moment or any longer. And so it's necessarily because it's self-destructive, it's self-undermining. And so it's necessarily per se irrational.
Hmm.
And so someone in their right mind cannot in principle will suicide. So the natural law theorist would say that if someone is attempting suicide, that is um, ex hypothesis, that is an indication that they are not in their right mind and can reasonably be stopped. Because if they were in their right mind, they would not be willing suicide, and so we are going along with what they would want if they were thinking
Yeah.
clearly, right?
Now I want to
You
push
might
back
be
on
able to
that.
extend that further as well to severe impairment by drugs or alcohol, right?
Hmm.
So you might be justified in stopping your friend from drinking the 12th shot or whatever, or maybe even stopping somebody from injecting heroin to a certain degree or a certain extent or something like that. But an important additional factor to this is that that would in no way merit punishment. None of these
Right.
would,
Well, except
right?
for
And
the
that's a
punishment
that's
of
a key to
yeah,
the legal aspect.
and that I guess we have to distinguish at that point. I do want to push back on your suicide bit there,
Hmm.
but that would that would also is putting them in a cage, so to speak, when it's rehab. If it's forced rehab, and it's not really a cage. It's not really a punishment either. It's medical assistance at that point.
Hmm.
And so I could see a case for that. I could see a case for society saying, look, this person is strung out to the point where they become useless to themselves and society. They're going to kill themselves by virtue of, continuing to string to shoot
Yeah.
up, and they're maybe even harming their family that's with them. Maybe they have a child, who knows? You know, some kind of forced rehab at that point, I could
Hmm.
see being a rational answer to that situation. Now that's different than smoking a blunt here and there. That's a very
Yeah.
different
No,
thing,
absolutely.
than if one is getting is one of if one is able to function and do their job and they're doing this as a recreational thing that um I know I read about a girl who was a heroin addict that was strung out in the streets, and when Amsterdam legalized it, she was actually able to wean herself down to the point where she would just use on the weekends as a
Hmm.
recreational thing. Obviously, uh, a bad idea. Obviously, still a mortal sin,
I
but
mean,
at that point, she's
okay,
working a
hold on.
job. She's
I'm open to the possibility that there could be morally illicit uses of heroin, but
Oh yeah, there
I
are. I
doubt
mean,
that's the
in in
case.
in the
No,
UK they use it
recreational.
as a I was gonna say in
Recreational.
the UK they use it as medicine. Yeah,
I'm going with recreational. I'm I
yeah,
am
fair enough.
I'm I'm open to the possibility that there could be morally illicit recreational uses for heroin. I think
Okay,
that's really
that's interesting.
unlikely based on based on what little I know of how the drug works.
Yeah,
But
I would agree. It's probably likely. I can't imagine a
probably
scenario
not.
that'd be
But
okay.
maybe.
I mean I
I
know
don't know.
marijuana. With marijuana I've never used it, but I'm told that it's similar to alcohol where in low
Hmm.
doses you're basically just getting a caffeine high. It's like
Right.
a
Yeah. And
similar
I
type of
know a lot of potheads,
experience.
so
Yeah,
there is a really big difference between like have smoked a joint and stoned out of your
yeah.
gourd.
And I know they say pot today is not your grandfather's weed, where like what they would smoke in the 60s and 70s, or
Hmm.
even what I believe Thomas Jefferson was the president who famously smoked weed in the White House back in the
Hmm.
early days of America when he had I believe he had a Muslim ambassador over and he smoked pot with them. I forget which
Hmm.
president that was. I believe it was that was a History
I
Channel
think that was
fact.
Jefferson. I
I think it was
remember
Jefferson.
something about that. I think it was Jefferson.
That was something I learned from the History Channel when I was a kid, so take that with a grain
Hmm.
of salt because the History
I
Channel is
think I've
always
heard
like,
something similar, and I think I remember being Jefferson, but
yeah,
also, yeah,
I think
viewers
that's before the
especially
War of
grain of
18
salt.
was before the War of 1812. But all to say is, back
Hmm.
then, they weren't breeding the marijuana to be such high THC as it is now. It was very,
Right,
from
right.
what I understand, even in the 60s and 70s, yeah, it made you relaxed. It was more relaxing than melatonin or
Mhm.
what you take in your bedtime tea. But it was definitely much lighter than what you get today. But even what you get today, from what I understand, you can take light hits, and it's more like equivalent to drinking a one alcohol to drinking six beers.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I mean,
um,
during our discussion, I have just had a beer and a coffee.
yeah,
So, both of those are
and that's why you're not
extremely,
crashing right now.
yeah, pretty much. When I live stream, I usually have got a beer and a coffee or a wine or I got
I think the last time
something
I
there,
had caffeine, I don't drink caffeine. It's like
Okay.
once every couple of years I'll have a tea or something, But
Okay.
yeah, if I had
Technically,
a
it's iced coffee,
coffee,
but
if I had a coffee, I'd be awake till the night after tomorrow night.
mm,
uh,
mm.
at this
I
point.
as an academic, I have what's called a problem.
Oh,
Um,
slight
but
addiction.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Um,
tried giving up coffee for Lent once, and it was not fair to the people around me.
Fair
I
enough.
was not a good person.
But yeah, so I think I can see a case for certain drugs being used recreationally,
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah,
provided
probably not
the
heroin.
high, yeah, I think probably
Yeah,
not heroin as well.
caveat.
But
I said this very speculatively.
yeah,
Probably not though.
yeah, marijuana is one I could see possibly being a
Mhm.
recreationally illicit in low THC amounts.
Mhm.
So, but I don't know.
Now,
That's not my call to
that
make, and
said,
it's not something I have a desire to do. So it's one
right.
of those things
Yeah.
where
And that actually is a key point too. I think that there could still perfectly well be, right, even if there is a legal or political right to, there could still be a social stigma against it, particularly in certain communities,
yeah,
right? If say your community, your friend group, your parish, your family d are not are just don't enjoy that sort of thing, then you might wind up making yourself a bit of an outcast from them. And that's
yeah.
its own social consequence.
Well, yeah, and a good example of that is Pennsylvania, actually, with our alcohol laws.
Hmm.
Pennsylvania is one of the strictest in the union with
Hmm.
alcohol. Us and I think Iowa are the only ones that still, until recently, you had to go to a state store. I have a funny story with that, actually. Anecdote. I had some friends over from Canada after I had graduated school. They were classmates of mine, and I knew their favorite beer was Fat Tire. So I
Hmm.
thought, okay, well, they're coming over, visit my Pennsylvania church, quote unquote. This was when I was still a modalist, so it wasn't even technically a Protestant community, let alone a
Oh no.
Christian community. But yeah, they're coming to visit my quote unquote church, and I thought, okay, well, I'm hosting, so I'll have some beer for him when he's here. And so I went to the grocery store, walked up and down the aisles, could not find the alcohol anywhere in the store. And so I finally asked one of the cashiers. I said, "Where's the alcohol? Does the guys not have it here?" And they said, "No, Pennsylvania, you have to go to the state store for alcohol." So I said, "Where's that?" And they said, "It's such and such a place." So I said, "Okay." And I then go to the state store. I walk in the state store and I'm walking up and down the aisles and I see whiskey, I see gin, I see wine and all this hard liquor, and I don't see any beer. And I finally say, "Okay, where's the beer?" And they say, "Oh, you have to go to the beer distributor for that. Pennsylvania law, you can't sell beer in the state stores. You have to sell it in the beer
What?
distributor." So I like, wait, where's the nearest beer distributor? They tell me where, and I drive to that. Then I get to the beer distributor, and I say, and I walk around, I walk up and down the aisles. I'm looking, I see 24 packs. I see, the big cases and just
Hmm.
lots and lots of beer. And I just want 12 pack. I finally say, okay, where's your six pack? Not 12 pack, I want a six pack. And I say, where's your six pack? They say, oh, Pennsylvania law, we can't carry six packs to the beer distributor. You have
Oh
to go to a
no.
bar for
What?
that. I said, you have to go to a bar for, okay. So where's the nearest
Ah,
bar? So I finally drive to the nearest bar. And this is where it's funny. Uh, I get to the bar and I said, "Okay, you guys have six packs here?" They said, "Yeah." They show me what they have because it's behind the counter. And I said, "Okay, do you have Fat Tire?" They said, "Oh no, the way Pennsylvania law works, that's one of the beers we can't carry in Pennsylvania." Like,
what?
okay, give me a
There
Sam
are
Adams.
specific beers they can't
Yeah,
carry in
there's specific
Pennsylvania.
kinds they can't carry. At least at the time, there were specific beers. The laws of light. Tom Wolfe, one of the great things he did, for all the bad
Ah,
things he did, he did lighten up the beer laws,
Oh my
um,
gosh.
but yeah,
See, I will say, okay, so maybe wrapping it up, but on the note of distributism, this is the kind of crap you would get with like anything like a guild system as well.
yes,
Just
yes,
so you know,
and
that
distributism
is
is
how that
basically
works.
guild socialism. I mean, distributism
Right.
is guild socialism. It's fascism, and the real fascism.
Yeah.
Not, I'm not using that word as an insult, which is how you say, but
Yeah.
it is a uh, privatized it is private profits with public control or government control
Mhm.
with privatized profits, and that is guild socialism. It's corporatism. It's fascism. Those are the three systems that are essentially the same system that is basically distributism. Um,
Chesterton even calls it corporatism.
oh well, there you go.
Yeah, he even
There you go.
refers to it as corporatism, distributism also. He uses both terms, but he uses them more or less
Interesting.
interchangeably.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a good little
I think it's
factoid to have
Chesterton. It
in my
might be
pocket.
Belloc in some places, but I think Chesterton does.
Oh, I hope it's both of them. I'd love to have that in my pocket. But
Yeah.
all I have to say though is to use your point about the social norms in Pennsylvania. I grew up. My family was teetotalers. They didn't believe in
Mhm.
alcohol, using alcohol at all. Like I remember mom talking about it being a sin to have even one beer. Um, and you know the culture in Pennsylvania is still very much in that post Mennonite, post Puritan culture of the alcohol is kind of a very frowned upon. Now it's loosened up a lot in recent years, but I remember as a kid thinking if you go into a bar, you're probably a bad person. Like the people that go into bars are
Okay.
not
Yeah.
people you want to hang out with. And when I went to South Carolina to go to school, um, people would say, "Hey, let's go to the bar after church." I'd be like, "Excuse me." Like, and you go to the bar, it's like it's just oh, it's a restaurant that happens to have some bar stools at it, but like,
Yeah.
it's a much classier environment than I would think of in Pennsylvania, where basically every bar is a dive bar until recently. You know, bars were all dive bars, if it's a bar. But yeah,
Yeah.
the social faux pas of going to a bar, though, is my point. You know,
Hmm.
it wasn't necessarily a sin to go into a bar, but in our culture, it was one of those things where if you're going into a bar, not a social faux pas, but it's socially frowned upon, it's because the kind of people going to
It
bars
has
they're there to get drunk. Yeah,
negative associations and connotations that matter,
yeah.
among
If
your community. Yeah.
yeah, 20 years ago, if you're going to a bar, you're getting drunk. That was the reason you're
Mhm.
going to a bar. At least from the people I knew and saw doing it, and that was why you go to a bar. And so
Mhm.
it was definitely like you don't want to be in a bar if you're an upstanding citizen. A good, nice, decent person that goes to church on Sunday shouldn't be in bars.
Mhm.
But you know, nowadays that's shifted. But you know, like you said, with you know certain drugs or alcohol, you know, different social contexts may look at it differently. I'll have to say,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
We should
So
probably wind this down. I don't want
okay.
to
I want to bring up
but
two more brief points
yeah,
and
yeah.
drag me back to it if I go too crazy. But this is more about the issue of freedom within distributism, economic
Yeah.
freedom specifically, right?
Yeah.
So the question will always arise, who is doing the distributing, right? Um, because it either turns into a kind of state socialism where the state is actually controlling the distribution of private property,
Hmm.
or it just turns into, well, wouldn't it be nice if society were like this,
Yeah.
right? And I always find that as a problem. Like, which one is it? Please tell me, because those are radically different claims. I disagree with
Yeah.
both of them, but they're radically different claims. If it's the
Yeah.
socialist thing, then I obviously disagree with it because it's using violence. The other one is more complicated, but
You do have Dr. Ryan Grant, who is an anarcho-distributist, and
right. Oh yeah, yeah. I have much more respect for
blessed,
that.
well, not blessed. She's a venerable Dorothy Day was an
Hmm.
anarcho-distributist as well. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'm very okay with distributism. If it's anarchist and it's just you know, this is how we're going to do things voluntarily in a free market type of
yeah,
system, but
yeah.
we
I mean, I still disagree with it for a
yeah,
couple of other reasons. Again, so
same.
the other thing is, uh, why I disagree with even voluntary distributism is one, economies of scale. Two, um, how do I put this? The security of wage labor. Let's put it that way. So economics of scale or economies of scale are essentially impossible under distributism if you have a wide distribution of the means of production, of ownership of the means of production. That means you can't have large cooperatives or large groups working together with shared common property rather than individually owned property. So, in other words, in my own context, the university becomes impossible because you can't have a university that owns the means of education and professors coming in and teaching and using
Mm.
those sort of collective means. All you'd have is independent scholars, maybe near each other, right? That's not a university. Right? And let me tell you, the university is a much older Catholic tradition than distributism,
Yeah,
or even
yeah, for
as
sure.
Catholic social teaching with the capital letters. Right. So no, I think that the whole economy of scale thing is almost fatal to distributism. The other aspect is, well, what if I just want to sell my labor? Can I do that? Or do I have to have, a small subsistence farm? Like,
Yeah,
or maybe more realistically, because there are distributors who are a little bit more realistic. What if I want to have, my artisan shop, or what if I don't want to have my means of production being my computer and software or whatever? What if I want to just go to work, sell my labor in exchange for pay? What if I don't want to run a sole proprietorship or be an entrepreneur? Because both of those things are extremely risky. And what if I'm really, really risk averse? Because I temperamentally am. I'm pretty risk averse.
yeah, yeah.
And I don't really have much of it in me to be an entrepreneur. It's not my temperament. Um, so what about all those people? Because there's obviously a lot of people who don't want to be entrepreneurs, don't want to own their means of production. Are you going to make them? Are you going to, or are you just going to, socially shame them until they decide to, open a
Right.
small business that's going to fail? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, um, yeah. I
I
think
will
that
say that
go
in
ahead.
a free market, I think it would be a lot easier. I know it would be a lot
Hmm.
easier to start your own business and succeed in a
Oh
free
yeah,
market.
absolutely.
For one, what is it, like 75% of the land in the United States is federally prohibited from building on. If we had
Hmm.
if they just had another westward expansion and open up the land in America to be farmed on and settled on, you'd have, assuming they didn't give first dibs to corporations and they actually had, like, real people
Oh
bidding
right,
on,
yeah.
had some kind of restriction on that. Being a farmer would be a lot easier at that point. Becoming a subsistence farmer might be a lot easier, doable for even poor people.
Hmm.
And starting a business of some kind, if they didn't have all the regulations making it difficult, hurdles to make you jump over. But yeah, I mean, even then, not everyone wants to
Yeah.
do it.
I mean, modern technology would help with that tremendously as well, right?
Yeah,
You can do subsistence farming now and not be just barely surviving if you have the if you have capital, if you have the technology available to you and the modern knowledge.
yeah,
Same with, a small business sole proprietorship kind of thing. It's much
yep,
easier to do that with technology we have now. But still, I don't, frankly, I don't want to.
right.
You
No,
know,
it's fair.
I
That's fair.
I like the
Although
security of having a paycheck.
on the other hand, you're still using your spare time to do something
Mhm.
with YouTube. I mean,
That's true.
you had like what, one, 2 or 3 thousand followers, a couple, quite a bit more than I do. But you have a decent following, which I imagine you're at the point where you could be potentially getting ad revenue, even if only it's through
Not,
uh
not actually, no, but
no, okay,
it's getting there.
uh
Keep
it's getting
watching.
there.
Guys,
Okay,
keep watching.
we'll do.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, and good reminder for anyone who's watching to like and subscribe. I always
Oh
forget to
yeah.
say that. I don't think I've ever said that in any of my videos. Like and subscribe, please. Comment below. I always forget to say that, and I feel like whatever,
Yeah,
shield for saying.
if you want me to be an entrepreneur, please go to ko-fi.com/Professor McCoy and throw money at me and I
Yes,
will do
indeed.
stuff for you. I will dance like a funny little
And
monkey or
I
whatever.
don't have a
Not
website,
literally.
so
I'm not I have a little dignity, so
yeah,
you
yeah.
get the idea.
I don't have a website like that, so throw money at him. I don't have any fancy websites to throw out, but
Throw money
um,
at me and tell me it's for Philip and I'll send it along. That's fine.
deal,
I can do that.
deal.
Yeah, well, thank you, Philip, for this great conversation. I love this sort of thing. And
Yeah, this
thank
was a lot
everybody
of
for
fun. I'd
watching.
love.
Make sure that if you're one of my viewers regularly, like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. And then go to Philip's channel and subscribe to him because if you like what I do, you'll like what he does. Absolutely.
Ditto in reverse for my viewers.